Hello there, my notary friends. This is Janessa West with Notary Newbies Mentor. And today we're going to talk about your Notary Journal, one of your best protections. Your journal of notarial acts is often required by law in many of the states. Virtually all states recommend keeping a journal of notarial acts, even if they don't require it. And it's just a sound business practice. It also protects the notary from unwarranted accusations of misconduct. Questions that we are going to address today is, why should I use a journal? What information should be entered into my journal? And how long should I keep the journal? A journal provides a detailed record that will protect you and your signer. Many states require a journal in detail that must be recorded about the notarization. Virtually all states recommend the use of a journal or some type of record. And a journal is a bound book with numbered pages. That's what's acceptable in the states that require it. And you must record your notarial acts chronologically. So again, not all states require a journal, but it's super important to keep one regardless. The states that don't require you to keep a journal at this time are the ones that are in white. The ones in red do require you to keep a journal. In Tennessee, it's required if a notary charges a fee. And in Delaware and Virginia, it's required for e-notarizations. So let's talk about your journal entries and what you actually are entering into your journal. Of course, you need the date and the time of the notarial act, the type of notarial act, and the address where you're doing the notary. And then the type of document and the date of the document. So let's step back here and talk about the address where the notarization is actually being performed. As you know, when you're filling out your acknowledgement, you are putting in the state and then also the county where your feet are planted at the time of entering or notarizing the document. And so it's also very similar when you're entering your journal entry. The address where you're performing the notarization needs to be noted. That might be the very same address that is found on the person's ID that you are notarizing the documents for. Therefore, you wouldn't need to record two different addresses if it's the same address as on their ID. But if it's a different location, let's say they moved since they got their driver's license, and now you're at their new residence, which of course that address is not going to match what's on their ID. So you would need to write in the actual address of where you're standing, and as well as recording their identification information. And then also when you're recording information in your journal, you're of course taking the name and the address of the signer and what type of identification the signer is providing to you. When you're writing in the identification of the signer, of course you want to note, is this person personally known to you as the notary? Or are you looking at a state-issued ID card? And what type of ID card is that? As you can see here, they've noted New York, NY, driver's license, DL. And then they recorded the driver's license number and the expiration date. If you are taking information from a credible witness, you would want to notate that they are a credible witness. If you have a space for notes in your journal, that's also a good place to write that in, that they are a witness. And then you would still take the same type of identification from them and notate that here, whether it's a driver's license, passport, or state issued ID. And then finally, you would want to notate the person's full name and have them sign your notary book. Any other additional information you might need to enter into your notary journal would be anything like I noted before, if they're a credible witness, or if there's a certain circumstance where maybe the signer is signing by mark because it's difficult for them to write their whole name. And so they're not able to actually sign their actual signature. So you would want to note that this was a notary by mark. And then you, of course, would also want to notate your notary fees, any money that you are collecting for the actual notarization. You do not need to record your travel fees or any printing fees or anything like that. You're strictly required to record your notary fees only. And then the signature of the signer, the person that you're notarizing for. And if your state requires it, you would also want to get a right thumbprint of that same signer. And just so you're aware, if you're working for an employer as a notary or you do notarial acts under your employment, they do have the full right to inspect and request copies of business-related entries that are in your notary journal. So, of course, they can't request any information for a notary that is done outside of your job. So if you did it on the weekend and you were not working, then that's your own business and your own information, and you would not have to share that with an employer. But if you're at work at the time that you do a notarization and they have a question about that, then they do have the right to look at your journal and ask for that information about that one specific signing. You do need to keep your journal locked and secured in an area that's under your control as a notary only. Leaving your journal in your car, even if it's locked, is not a proper way to keep your journal. Never, ever surrender your journal to anyone unless it's subpoenaed by a court. And you would know that. You'd get served with a subpoena, and it would indicate that you have to go to court, and then the court would tell you what it is that they need from your journal, and then you would have to hand it over. There would be a whole process involved in that. And then your journal, even if you are working for an employer, that's your journal. So it goes with you, your journal, your stamp, everything that has to do with your notarial acts goes with you if you no longer work for the employer. Even if they paid for those items, they are still your property as a notary. And then depending on state laws and commissioning authority, you do have to let your state know within it's 10 days for my state. It might be different for yours, but it's typically around 10 days. You should check with your Secretary of State or your commissioning authority to find out, but you have to notify them if your stamp or your journal are lost, stolen, or damaged. A notary may be responsible to turn in their journal to its designated official or agency. And when state law does not address disposal of a journal, it's recommended that you keep a hold of each journal for 10 years from the last date of entry. And you do need to keep those journals locked and safe. So if you're a notary only for a year, you still have to keep that notary journal for 9 more years from the last date that you did your last notary entry. And in conclusion, your journal can provide valuable evidence if a notarized document is lost or stolen. It can be very helpful. You must record your acts chronologically, so one after the other. If there's an odd date stuck somewhere on a page, it's going to come into question if your notary journal is ever inspected. Each notarization should have its own entry. So every single time you stamp and sign a document to notarize it, it needs to have its own line item entry. I know this is a little bit of a battle and a question. It comes up quite often in a lot of the notary groups. And the fact of the matter is each time you notarize something, it's a document that stands on its own. So it needs its very own line item in your journal entry. And that could be better explained in saying that if you had to go to court for, let's say, a real estate transaction, a deed, and you did multiple notaries in that transaction when you visited that client, and it was only the deed that was in question, they don't want to see the 5 other notarizations that you did that day, or they might, but that's not what's in question. And that deed needs to have its very own line item because the deed is what is in question. And that would stand the same with any of the other documents that you notarize that same day. They each need to have their own line item. In some states, in some states, ditto marks and signing on a diagonal line are acceptable shortcuts. In some, they are not. You need to be very clear with what your state allows and recognizes. Always complete your journal entry before you complete the notary certificate. Why is this important? Well, I can tell you if you sign and stamp the notarial certificate and it's the same document as to which the person is asking you to notarize, if you're not doing a loose leaf a certificate, then they could grab it from you and run, and they've not signed your notary journal, they've not paid you, it's not recorded, you don't have any of the information in your journal. So it's extremely important to completely fill out your journal before you sign and stamp a document. Your journal is an exclusive property of the notary, regardless of who paid for it or who gave it to you. And again, if it's an employer, it's yours, regardless. If you quit, it goes with you. In fact, it's your responsibility, 100%. Documentation in a journal will protect the notary from liability because it's a record of the transaction. And that's why it's good to put in as much detail as possible while you're standing there doing the actual notarial act. That way it's there. You don't have to try to recall any information, because if you're a busy notary, or maybe 10 years have passed since you did that notarization and that comes to question for some reason, and you have to look back on it, and you're not going to remember the specific details of the situation. So you need to actually record them at the time of the notarization. In Missouri, the specifics for recording your journal Again, it has to be a chronological journal of acts, and it has to be maintained and protected and provided if there is any lawful inspection requested. A journal must be permanently bound with numbered pages, and a notary shall maintain only one active, permanently bound journal at the same time. A notary shall keep your journals for a period of no less than 10 years from the last date of entry in Missouri. For every notarial act, the notary shall record in the journal at the time of notarization the date and time of the notarial act, the type of notarial act, the type, title, or description of the document or preceding document, the signature, printed name, and address of each principal signing, signature, printed name, and address of each requester in fact. So if you're doing an attorney in fact signing, you would need their information. If you are having a credible witness, you would record their information just the same as you do for any notarial act. Evidence of identity for each principal. The principal signer is personally known to the notary, or a notation of the type of ID, issuing agency, identification number, and the date of issuance or expiration. If you don't have that information, you do need the handwritten signature and name and address of each credible witness swearing or affirming to the principal's identity. And for credible witnesses who are not personally known to the notary, a description of their identification documents that is a state-issued ID, passport, or state-issued driver's license. You also need to record the fee, if any, charged for a notarial act, and the address of where the notarial act was performed, if that's not the same address where you normally perform your notary work at your place of business. And specifically for Missouri, a notary shall not ever record a social security number or credit card in their journal. A notary may record in the journal the circumstances for not performing or completing any requested notarial act. This is also important if there's ever a situation or something unique to that notarial act. You should also record that in your journal as well. Just because, like I said before, if 10 years or more have passed and something comes to question, then you would definitely want to be able to just open your journal, look at that page, look at that line entry, and have that information there so that you don't have to try to recall something. It's just not going to be possible. So you should record any type of notations that you need for that specific entry. And then finally, as required, a notary shall append to the pertinent entry in the journal a notation of the nature of date of the notary's correction of a completed notarial certificate corresponding to the entry. So if you have made any changes or updates on a document that has anything to do with that entry, you most definitely need to record that as well. Okay, that is it. If anybody has some questions or would like to discuss this further, the floor is open.